So thanks everybody for coming for another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Jonathan Haskel with us from Imperial College. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Markus. Thank you for having me along.
Great. Jonathan will talk about AI and productivity, a general purpose technology approach. So we will learn today what happens as we move to a higher productivity stage. We go through transition phases. And typically, when you move from a transition, let's say from a lower productivity level, and then you have innovation and the transition, a slow transition, let's say, and there's a higher innovation frontier. It is always takes typically time to implement this, and the diffusion of technology across the economy will take some time. And typically when we do so, we go through a J-curve effect. So first, the old technology gets outdated, but it takes a while until we learn using the new technology, and then we get actually a downturn first before we catch up and go to the new frontier, hopefully. Of course, there are also some tipping points sitting around, and we might ask if the transition occurs very fast, like in this case in the dashed line, then actually the J-curve effect might be more dramatic, so you go down, the setbacks are even more dramatic, you might hit a tipping point and then you might never come back. So that's the concept resilience comes into place, while the slow transition actually comes with a resilient structure where you bounce to the new higher frontier, you come back and go even better than you started out with, while in the second, the fast transition, it actually might happen that you hit a tipping point, and then actually the whole system might derail, our society might even derail, or the economy might derail. So that's essentially some dangers we have to watch out for. And of course, we will see today with Jonathan explaining we had earlier transition phases in technology, introducing the steam engine, introducing electricity and other new technologies, how the AI thing we can learn from the earlier transition phases and earlier shifts, not only shocks, how to be resilient against these shifts in technology. Now, whenever we have this shift in technology, there's also a change in concentration of power. And I was wondering whether there's a cycle. So initially there are many entrants. Everybody tries to experiment, new firms come along with new technology, but then it's followed by a shakeout period. And then there's a shakeout period of very few then actually will survive. And there might actually, some monopoly rents might appear. And this might also be very different from technology to technology. Until then some antitrust regulation comes into place, where essentially then, we try to regulate the monopoly rents away and have a more healthy long-run economic structure. Again, it's like this J-curve phenomenon here. And the question is, does this cycle depend on the type of innovation? And I think Jonathan will talk about a general technology. He will very much make the case we are facing a general technology, or it is just an advancement of innovation technology, or it's a much more narrow sector-specific technology. And then also the question is whether the cycle depends on the speed of innovation, whether that's, the innovation is phasing in at a slow pace or is phasing in a very fast pace. And also, how the adaptation and the diffusion happens, at what speed that happens. So that depends, also the resilience. And then there's this power question. It's on the one hand, I argued about the monopoly rents as like about pricing power, but it could also be the power to shape the society in the future. We will change our social norms. We can now do things with new technology which we couldn't do before. And we have to find new social norms and new regulation, and who is shaping them, who has the power to shape that. And perhaps you can also learn something from earlier transition phases, who was actually deciding, who was winning in society, who was losing, and who was actually determining the direction of the new technologies. So let me stop here and invite Jonathan to give his perspective on the productivity enhancements we will experiencing, hopefully, and on the general purpose technology he's arguing for. So thanks again, Jonathan. The floor is yours, and I'll stop sharing my slides and then.
Thank you very much indeed, Markus. Let me likewise share my screen. I'm going to take over. I'm going to select this window. I'm going to share that like that. I hope everybody can see the slides.
Perfect.
Can people see the slides? Brilliant. I can't see anyone except for Markus, which is, of course, a great pleasure. But I hope everybody can see everything. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. And thank you, Markus, again, for inviting me. And greetings wherever you are from a rather rainy London. Surprise, surprise. So I'm going to talk about AI, as Markus has said, as a general purpose technology, hopefully with some nuances. And then I'm going to be very reckless and try and give you an estimate of how much I think AI is going to improve productivity. I should say straight away that this is joint work with my wonderful colleagues listed there for you, Filippo Bontadini, Corrado, Cecilia Jona-Lasinio. So let me try and advance the slides here. I hope you can see this. As it says, there are wide estimates of the effect of AI on labour productivity. And here's a graph from some very good work done at the OECD with that link that you can click onto there. On the left-hand side, we have various papers by Martin Bailey, Erik Brynjolfsson and Jan Kouriak, giving estimates of around 2.5% of productivity, so rather high estimates. On the right-hand side is the OECD's estimates with a band going from sort of 0.3 to 1. And then you can see sort of in the middle on the right, Darren Acemoglu has an estimate, which is again very widely quoted, which I know, Markus, you've talked about on previous webinars, giving a very low estimate. I should say some of these estimates are TFP, some of these estimates are labour productivity. We can go into all of that. But I think what you want to get is a sense of the broad range of estimates that there are, ranging from a sort of very, almost no effect on productivity to, 3.5 percentage points. Let's start then with something that we're not going to do, which is how a number of these studies get their estimates. But what I'm going to try to do is sit what we're trying to do in that literature. So if I click onto the next slide, this attempts to describe what is called the task-based approach. So what is the task-based approach? This is a very inventive and sophisticated approach, and it goes like this. As it says on the slide, the assumption is that AI reduces the cost of labour on certain tasks, and so the implied cost reduction, or the gain in TFP, consists of all those terms on the slide. So kind of apologies for the algebra, but let me talk you through what each term is, and I hope it's fairly intuitive. The overall big bracket is multiplied by the labour share, the idea being that if there's a cost reduction of labour only, to translate that into a TFP reduction, you have to multiply by the labour share. But the action is in the big bracket. So the first bit of the big bracket says...
Just to understand,
what is
the total value of the economy, or...?
I'm so sorry, Markus. Yes, PVV is the value added in the economy.
Okay,
yes, indeed.
okay.
Nominal value added. Yeah. So that's the share of labour in total GDP. Thanks for clarifying that. Let's go to the action in the brackets there. The first term in the brackets is the wage share of tasks exposed to AI. So this is really an incredibly innovative and clever piece of analysis here, which involves essentially taking the computer and asking ChatGPT to go through all the occupations and all the various tasks involved in all those occupations and give some sense of the extent to which they might be replaced plausibly by AI, and then convert that into a wage. And I'll have another slide which goes into a little bit more detail on that in a moment. The next thing you do, having found out the wage share of tasks exposed to AI, you go on to the next term, which is to say, well, a task might be exposed to AI, but could it be profitably replaced by AI? And this is some very innovative work done on visualization software and the extent to which that might replace workers. Then you have an estimate of the cost savings, and then some estimate of how long it's going to take to realize those cost savings. So that goes back to what Markus was talking about in his introduction about the path over which you might expect all this to occur. I'll come back to some of the details about this in a second, but let's look at some numbers. The share of labour in value added is 0.5. These are from Darren Acemoglu's work. He's drawn on some studies which suggest that 20% of the wage share of tasks exposed to AI, that's the first term in the brackets, of those tasks exposed, 23% could be profitably automated over the next 10 years. giving you on average a 27% cost savings. That's a big cost saving, but it takes 10 years to do that. Converted then into a per year figure, dividing by a tenth. And that gives you the very low number, which I mentioned at the very beginning. Where do those other estimates come from? I hope you can see where is if you thought that the cost savings were higher, that 0.27 would go up. If you thought that the share of tasks which could be automated was higher, that 0.23 could go up. If you thought things were coming faster, that tenth might become a fifth, and so on. Okay, I'll return to that in a second. But what I want to go on to is, again, touching on what Markus said in the introduction, is how we think about AI and the relationship with general purpose technologies, and an aspect of general purpose technologies I think is maybe a little bit neglected. So let me say something word about that. What's a general purpose technology? So confusingly, GPT means something else in chat GPT, but GPT here means general purpose technology. And lots of economists have written terrific work on this. Here are two, Bresnahan and Trachtenberg, talking about pervasive use in a wide range of sectors and the technological dynamism. So steam and electric motors, for example, were amazing inventions which saved energy, replacing horses, and then the electricity replaced the steam. But also, they then involved the redesign of transport equipment, so steam engines as opposed to horse carriages, and factories, which were enabled by the design of independently powered machines. So the general purpose technologies had that dynamism and that pervasiveness. There's a slightly different dimension to all of this, which is an innovation in the method of innovation. So let me say a word about this. So this is the phrase comes from Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote with Bertrand Russell in the 1920s in the UK. And it is essentially what it says on the tin, namely it's a new way of innovating, popularized in economics by hybrid Korn. And there's a wonderful discussion in a very recent paper by Bailey, Byrne, Kahn and Soto, which is linked to on the screen there, about AI. Let me pause for a second and just sort of say what this is. I must say, when I first read the Gorillakis paper on hybrid corn, I just thought to myself, hybrid corn, that's just a type of corn. I come from the city, so I have no idea what's going on in the countryside. And the whole point about hybrid corn is that it isn't just a type of corn, it's a method of breeding different types of corn to optimally get the corn to grow in the local area. So it's an innovation in the method of innovation, because, as I say, it's a way of generating those new types of corn. And what we're going to argue then is that AI is not only a GPT, a general purpose technology widely applicable, but, this is the crucial thing, it's also an invention in the method of invention because of the way that learning goes on. Again, just to situate things in the literature, if I may, I've mentioned Acemoglu, who, like all good economists, is absolutely clear about his assumptions. He says he does not discuss, there's a little quote there, how AI can have revolutionary effects by changing the progress of science. And the excellent paper in the OECD team also do the same. So they do lots of great stuff, don't get me wrong. But I think our study is a complementary study to theirs, which asks the question, what would the numbers look like if one took this slightly extra step? Let me just populate
but
this.
You will make a case that it will is treated.
I'm sorry, Markus. Yep.
In IMIs, you provide a convincing case that we have really a general purpose technology rather than a sector-specific, sector by sector.
Yeah. So let me say a word about this, Markus, in this slide here. Which is a little matrix based on the work of Nick Crafts and Ian Coburn and others, and maybe populate it with a little bit of examples, and hopefully this will work. So let's go to the top right, electricity and steam. They feel like a general purpose technology. Autonomous vehicles is another example there, because they're pretty pervasive. So autonomous vehicles are not quite yet on our streets, at least in London, but they're enormously used in industrial applications, in mining and quarrying, for example. Nobody drives those huge super trucks anymore. They're all done often 1,000 miles away by a screen. So they are a general purpose technology, but they don't seem like they're an invention in the method of invention. Whereas on the bottom left there, the hybrid corn example, which I just mentioned, is an invention in the method of invention, but it's not so general purpose. So on the far right then, and Markus, this speaks, I hope, to your question, is what would an example be of a general purpose technology which is also an invention in the method of invention? I've got two, ICT and deep learning. Deep learning is, of course, behind AI, so in some sense, that is exactly that. It's going to allow us to learn things better and innovate better. And ICT had an element of that as well. So it became easier to search what other scholars were doing, for example. It became easier for firms to find out what other firms are doing. The paper I mentioned by Bailey Byrne and colleagues has got a long description of what looks like some emerging evidence that AI is both widely used, but also an invention in the method of innovation. So it's quite broadly being patented, it's broadly being cited. As I say, scientists are using it increasingly in the work that they do. Okay, so let me push on then and try and get to, so I've got the red box there just to say where we're at. As Markus said in his introduction, let's get started by talking about STEAM. So here are some pictures for you. The building you can see behind me is Imperial College, where I work in the UK. And if you've been to London, right in the back of Imperial College is the Science Museum. And in the Science Museum are James Watt's original steam engines. And here's one from 1797. Of course, there was tremendous technical progress in the steam engine itself. So this is an American invention, the Corliss steam engine, which was still a steam engine, but used much less fuel and much more power. And then, of course, steam then was spread out to the whole of the economy. So this is the general purpose technology notion. So there's a steam-powered flour mill in London, just a few miles from where I am now, a steam ship, and at least famous in the UK, a steam railway engine as well. So that was the implementation of it. Now, to get a handle then on how much that general purpose technology might have raised productivity, which is going to be the start to trying to find out how much the innovation, the method of innovation raises productivity. Let me go through the STEAM example. I'm going to follow the example of a wonderful economic historian called Nick Crafts, I'm sure known to many, who passed away last year. With some apologies for some equations, I'll try to have the minimum number of equations, but just here are a couple just to guide us. Think of two sectors in the economy. One sector produces tangible investment goods, so that might be steam engines, and there's the production function, so it's producing investment goods, so I is the output, with technology A, and it's a function of capital and labour. And so in a sort of dynamic form, the increase in investment goods, so this is the first equation there, is going to be the increase in labour times the output elasticity of labour. That's the share of labour, so PLL is the payments to labour in the I sector, and then the I sector has value added PII. And then the payments to capital are going to be the output elasticity of the capital sector times the amount of capital, and then the final term is an increase in TFP. The consumption goods sector is going to use that new capital, again think steam engines, to provide, think transportation services, using the labour with an output elasticity of the share of labour, and using the capital with the output elasticity of the rental share of capital, and there's going to be the TFP. So again, it's two sectors, the production sector, which is producing the steam engines, and the using sector, railways, coal mines were very important for steam as well. A couple more equations for you. If we start adding all this up together to get value added, so little v is value added, we can write labour productivity growth, I hope in a reasonably intuitive way, which is this is just adding up essentially, which is the sum of two bits. So the first bit is labour productivity is going to grow if TFP is going to grow. And this tells you that TFP grows if TFP grows in the upstream sector, that's the steam engine sector, and in the downstream sector, that's the railway sector. And then the second bit tells you that labour productivity is going to grow if there's capital deepening. And this tells you the capital deepening in the upstream sector and the capital deepening in the downstream sector. So last equation then, which is going to serve us for when we do some work on AI, is what is the additional labour productivity growth you might get when you have a new flourishing sector like steam? it's going to be as written there for you. It's going to be the TFP growth in the steam sector times its share, and the capital deepening of the use of steam times its output elasticity there as well. And that's all written down for you. So again, if you're familiar with kind of growth accounting and remember your sort of Cobb-Douglas production functions, all we're doing is we're finding out how much TFP growth, this extra TFP growth is contributing to labour productivity, and how much the capital deepening is contributing to labour productivity as well. And the job of, well, economic historians is to measure all this stuff over the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to try to measure this stuff more recently as well. Now, the question then that the economic historians asked, and this was Nick Kraft's great discovery, is what on the face of it seemed like an odd question, which is why was the impact of general purpose technologies so small when they were so productive? After all, steam engines was extraordinarily more powerful than human beings and horses, and so you'd expect them to completely revolutionize productivity growth. But Nick Kraft's work found, along with others, that this was rather small, and it turns out, I think, to be helpful to go through these terms. So let me animate in a few of the terms. So between 1760 and 1860, which is when steam engines were being rolled out, that's a whole century, so that's a long time, TFP growth was a couple of percent. I'll show you some figures for ICT in a minute, but that's pretty fast TFP growth. In Britain, where TFP growth is basically naught, we would love TFP growth to be 2%, I have to say. What about capital deepening? There was a lot of capital deepening going on, and one should know this just from a casual acquaintance of economic history. Railways were being built, steam engines were being introduced in factories and so on. So you might say, gosh, all those numbers look pretty big. Why wasn't there an effect on productivity? And the answer, as you can see from the algebra, which is why I was trying to go through this, is you then have to multiply everything by its shares. Now, the share of steam actually was, at least on average over this period, was pretty small. It was only 2%. It reached around 3% by the 1860s, but it took 100 years for that to be the same. And likewise, the share of steam payments in capital, there's a lot of capital around, that was only around 0.5%. And so the overall contribution then of steam turned out, despite all of this, what seemed to be a tremendously productive technology, turned out to be rather small, about 0.1 on average. Now, it's true that by the end of the period, this got up to a slightly higher level than this, but it took a long time for it to be the same. Markus, in your introduction, you mentioned electricity. And again, the economic historians have documented this in electricity. The total contribution of electricity again, took a long time to come through. In the US, it reached about 0.2% to labour productivity in the years before the war. Again, because although there was strong TFP, these shares initially were rather small. Now, let me contrast that with ICT.
Basically, it's all about slow diffusion of the technology, in a sense, or the adoption of the new technology. It started very small, but it stayed small over decades. That's what you're arguing, no?
Indeed. Of course, the adoption is sort of deeply endogenous in a way. It's endogenous to the prices, which are going to be driven in turn by the TFP. But it's also endogenous to what you were saying in the introduction, the types of institutional structures and the rules and regulations and the way that the economy
you would say even in
is
case regulation kept the adoption slow?
Oh, you're testing my knowledge of economic history to the limit there, Markus. So I'm sure there are economic historians on the call who would be able to answer that question much better than me. But yes, indeed. I mean, there's lots of studies. So Joel Markier, the economic historian from Northwestern, has studied extensively the sort of network of skills, the network of information flows and so forth, which either helped or hindered these types of diffusion of these technologies. Okay, thanks. Let me move on then to say ICT, a slightly more recent example. Now, the ICT number is actually much bigger. So I've got it up on the top of the slide here of 0.7. Why is it bigger? Well, again, this is an application of this. The first thing is this is Oliner and Sickles' numbers between 73 and 95. TFP was going on at 22%. So if you thought steam was a high TFP industry, ICT is really something driven by transistors and all of that. The capital deepening was much higher as well. And the shares were rather bigger. Actually, interestingly, the share of production was not that bigger, but the share of the use of ICT got to be bigger. And hence you had these much larger numbers than you had before. So what we're going to do then is we're going to try to make forecasts of these various numbers and say something about how ICT fits into all of this. But I wanted to go through all of this. I hope this has been useful for people. I wanted to go through all of this as a sort of way of positioning how we're going to do our effects of ICT. We're essentially going to take a stand on what we think is going to happen to TFP and the capital deepening and the various shares and argue that they're rather large. That's essentially where we're going to go on this. But before that, if I may, let me just set up then the question about what is AI. And this goes back to the issue about how do we think about AI in this framework. We found very useful the paper by Alan. This is just a short briefing paper which sort of sets out a nice way of thinking about AI, and let me go through all of that. Of course, AI has been going for quite a while now. You could even trace it back to lectures at Dartmouth College in the 1960s where people coined the term. But Alan essentially talks about two generations of AI. The first generation is what he calls handcrafted knowledge AI, and there's a nice example here from the Deep Blue chess computer, which is pictured there on the right, which beat the then chess champion Garry Kasparov. Now that ran software, amazing software, which did essentially two things. The first is it had the rules of chess in them, so the bishop can only move diagonally and all of that. And the second thing is hand programmed in was advice from chess experts, which the programmers went round to get, and they programmed in a kind of best response function. And that computer managed to beat Garry Kasparov. Now, what I think is interesting about this, it's not that the computer could beat Garry Kasparov, because even the world's greatest chess player can be outthought by a computer in terms of processing moves. But what's miraculous about it is that the software writers managed to write a piece of software by hand which had all of these responses in it, which could then beat the chess player. And that then leads to the way of thinking about the traditional software as illustrated here, namely that you have some input data, your opponent's chess move, you have some Huber programmed rules in the way that I just described, that gives you traditional software, and that gives you some output. Okay, so that's the first generation. The next generation is characterized by machine learning. Let me say a word about how to think about machine learning, and if you'll forgive me, I have a snappy title here for fans of science fiction under Do Androids Recognize Eclectic Sheep? And what's going on here? Facial recognition is something everybody will be familiar with who's traveled to an airport. But facial, and that technology has evolved enormously. But facial recognition turns out to be very important in animal husbandry because you want to identify, if you're a farmer, the most fertile, in this case, ewes, in the case of sheep breeding. But no farmer can identify all of the offspring of the various different sheep, especially if you've got farms with 30,000 sheep on it. It's impossible to do. So this is an important problem in computer science, and there's a reference there to an actual scholarly study on this issue about how you do facial recognition amongst sheep. Now, what's the point about all of this? It's too hard not only for humans, but, and here's the relation to the Kasparov example, the Deep Blue example, it's too hard for handmade software as well. It's just too difficult for a human being to program all the steps about how you would recognize the sheep, the dimensions of the face and the shadows and all that kind of thing. So how is it done instead? Well, this is what machine learning and artificial intelligence do, is you feed the computer a series of pictures. So this would be an example of unstructured data. You train it on a subset of pictures. You use the train software to recognize then all of the pictures, and various varieties of AI involve more or less human intervention. So again, with apologies to those who work in this, I'm sure I've been much too crude in the description, but what I find helpful then is that completing this schema here is the contrast of machine learning, which is on the bottom side of the panel, with the handcrafted knowledge, which is on the top of the panel. So you can see this a little bit different. The AI software on the bottom there is the outcome of some training data. I'm reading the middle dotted box there with a machine learning training algorithm. And that gives you, as I say, that kind of software. So it's the machine then which is learning, which is doing the learning. The learning then is the innovation in the method of innovation. And this is why we think that this AI is a little bit different. I'll just pause for a slight second. We've been talking about GPTs, but of course there's ChatGPT, and you might be wondering what ChatGPT is. So just to try to bring this schema to life a little bit, ChatGPT is generative AI, so it produces output with responses and new content. The P in GPT stands for pre-trained, and we've just seen there's some training data. And the T stands for transformer. Transformer is a particular type of neural network machine learning. So that's kind of where that situates. Now, if you then emphasize this change in software as being an important part of AI, we then want to go back to the apparatus I was describing before, which is about capital and TFP and this and that and the other, and try to understand where software sits in the national accounts. Is it capital or investment, or what kind of good is it? So let's just do a little bit of revision. The economists will be familiar with all of this. Where is software in GDP? There are two types of investment in GDP. There's tangible, and there's a list there for you: computers and buildings and vehicles and so forth. So vehicles would be steam engines back in the day. And then there's intangible investment as well. That's investment in ideas and notions and so forth, of which software and databases is one, R&D is another, and artistic originals is another. So the way we're going to locate this is we're going to locate this as a productivity improvement in the intangible sector, mirroring the productivity improvement in the tangible sector, which was the steam engine example and the electricity example that I had before. But before I just talk about some numbers, let me just go on a slight digression, if you don't mind, and say something about the relationship to the task literature, which I talked about at the very beginning, under the heading, what do the task exposures measure? So here's the various measures that people use, and this is this very inventive computer science economics literature, and they are these. So one measure, which turned out to be rather small numbers, asks which tasks using large language models can decrease the time to complete currently an activity by 50%. The larger numbers, which are the numbers which most people use in the literature, ask whether the additional software could be developed. So this is the actual words which are used to prompt the computer that could reduce the time it takes, including image generation systems. So if you look at that a little bit, and then you put on a sort of growth accounting, capital, steam engines hat, what this feels like, at least to us, is it's sort of asking about software capital deepening in that kind of language. That is to say, these questions are really saying, could we have a bit more software which could do this task? So what then is our interpretation of AI? Let me say that, and then I promise I'll get into the numbers. One narrow interpretation is to say, as I've just said, it's an improvement in software. So the production would be total factor productivity growth in software writing. That would be coding and all that kind of thing as well. The use would be the software capital deepening that I've just mentioned. But on the other hand, you might want to be a little bit more aggressive than that and say, actually, AI has got a slightly broader application, software and other things. Firstly, AI uses data. We went through the pre-training of the data stuff, the data in that example being the pictures of the sheep. And so it would have to be total factor productivity growth in data and capital deepening in data. That gets you to some tricky national income accounting, which I won't bore you with. But essentially, the forthcoming revision in the national income accounts will treat data separately as an asset. At the moment, it's rolled into software and probably not measured very well. So there's probably an understatement going there. So that would be one extension. And the second extension then relates to the work which is done on the management and the business side. So we mustn't forget that research and that constituency there. So here's some work by McKinsey. And as you can see on the left-hand side, the point there is that they go around asking businesses about their business functions and find that AI affects many intangible business functions. So there's a graph there on the right, and I apologize that's come out rather small. But what they find is that AI helps with R&D, with branding, and with customer operations. So again, it's not just software. It might be those other business functions as well. Let me then try to get to some numbers and then I will conclude. Before then, I'm going to extend the model one more step. As you remember, before I had the tangible investment goods, they're now in the middle, and the consumption goods, they're now at the bottom. But now we're going to have some intangible investment goods. So think software, think R&D, think marketing and branding, and consumer consumer relation strategies and so forth. And so those are going to be produced in the sort of second, as it were, upstream sector. And then those the results of those intangibles, the results of all that software, are going to be used in the consumption sector. So DN is the production of new intangibles, and that's investment, which is going to build a capital stock of R, which is in the consumption sector there. Okay, and so it's going to be the same kind of technology. What's going to be the effect of software and data, or broader, if you like, R&D and all that kind of thing? It's going to be the production of the software and the data, or the intangible business functions, and their use downstream.
So, Jonathan, can I ask you?
Sorry, Markus. Yeah.
When Darren Acemoglu's paper takes a whole input-output table structure into account, no? Do you capture this too? That there's input-output table as a whole, production chain potentially, and then it's feeding back into upstream firms and all this. Does your analysis capture all of this?
Yeah. So the way I think about that, Markus, good question, and in the longer presentation, hopefully I could try to make this clear. So let me try to give a short answer, which is the way to think about that is what Darren Acemoglu and various others are doing is they're concentrating on the first bit of it, namely what are all the TFP improvements in all the various sectors in the economy. So there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's fine. But we're also then adding in the possible capital deepening effects as a consequence of those TFP improvements. So again, I think in the end, they sort of come to something fairly similar in terms of the upstream production effect, but we're adding in the use effect as well. Let me say something then quickly about these numbers, and I'm going to just do a couple of things. The first thing is to do a little case study of the software industry. So what my colleagues and I have done here is we've taken some NAICS industries in the US, which are sort of close to the software producing industry. So for example, NAICS 511 is publishing, so that would include computer software, computer games, but it unfortunately includes newspapers, so that overstates the amount of software. Division 518 is data processing and internet publishing and that kind of thing, so again it's sort of handling the data and data sets. And 5415 is custom software as well. Having said all of that, those sectors not only produce software, but they do also produce other services as well, like, for example, managing cloud services and so forth. So that figure there, so those industries overstate the amount of software that's being produced. But on the other hand, lots of firms produce software on their own accounts. If you go to a bank, for example, you have software departments in the bank writing software to be used on, our mobile phones and for our mobile kind of banking. So with that caveat in mind, let's just have some numbers from the US, and let's start in 2010 up to 2014 to give a sense of this. Measured TFP growth is 2, so that's pretty fast. The share of software those industries in value added is quite a lot, that's 5%. It's a contribution of 0.18. TFP sped up after 2014 to 4% and giving you a slightly bigger contribution. So this is sort of before AI. This is a sort of big data era. but I shouldn't say before AI, because AI was starting to be introduced. The transformer models were starting to come in 2017, but this was before ChatGPT and all of that. But already, software was TFP was going pretty quickly. What about capital deepening? Capital deepening of software is proceeding at a heck of a pace in the US. 4% in that early period, 7% in that early period, in that later period, and then you can see the contribution there as well. So these are quite big numbers already before the AI time. I'll say one more thing, which is the most recent data, 2019 to 2023, which I'm animating in now, gets you even bigger numbers. So TFP is now going at 6. The share has gone up, right? Not surprisingly, people are using more, an even bigger contribution. Capital deepening, which was going at 7, is now going at 10. And the share has gone up as well. So we're already talking about quite big contributions just from software alone. So almost 0.4% from the production effect, that's the top box, and again almost 4% from the diffusion effect, that's the bottom box as well. So that says, I think, that it looks like there are possibly quite powerful effects of AI already. Now, what we do in the paper is we then ask about the future. And let me go through this fairly quickly, and then I'll stop. So just a couple more slides. What this model does, and again, sort of apologies that this is probably a little difficult to follow without all the various algebra, but it essentially has behind the back of it a two-sector model where you've got a fast-moving upstream sector with lots of TFP growth, which is producing, in our case, intangible goods, AI goods in the downstream sector, which it's then using. And it works through what the steady state implications are of that. So it sort of endogenizes the capital deepening that we've just seen as an actual number. That gets you this bottom equation here. So let me just try to talk through the intuition behind that. It says, what's the extra steady state productivity growth you'd get? Again, 2 bits. If you're producing upstream, the share of upstream being the omega, share in value added, it's the TFP advantage in the upstream sector times how big the upstream sector is. And then since you're then using it in the downstream sector, and the using it is endogenous as well, it's the TFP advantage there scaled by the share of labor and by the share of payments that you're making to this advanced capital. So if you think about a one sector model, this essentially says that the increase in productivity is like TFP divided by the share of labor, which is kind of standard result from the solo model. So this is a sort of steady state relationship. Again, Markus, going back to your introduction, we don't quite know how long this is going to play out and all of that. But this is at least a model with some numbers that we can calibrate. So I'm going to give you a last set of numbers and then I will conclude. What this table does is it does the calculation that I've just described in the following way. If you look along the top row, you can see that TFP advantage that I talked about. If you've got the upstream sector with a weak TFP advantage of 0.5, you're in the first column. If, on the other hand, you think the upstream sector has got a strong TFP advantage of 5, you're in the final column. Okay. Now I'm going to read across the rows. The rows tell you how big, essentially, you think that upstream sector is, and the downstream payments, which will set just equal, just to get things easy, are. So if you think you've got a relatively small sector, the upstream sector, then that's the top row there, a share of GDP of about 5. Right? If you think it's a bit bigger, then it's about 10%, 0.1. If you think it's even bigger, it's 0.15. And then each number in the table then tells you what the steady state productivity advantage is going to be. So again, the top left figure there, that number there of 0.06, which as I think about it kind of looks close to what Darren Acemoglu is finding, that would be a number in this two-sector model where you have not much productivity advantage in the upstream and quite a small upstream sector. On the other hand, the very aggressive number on the far right there, that's the bold 1.94, tells you you've got a big sector producing this stuff, and my goodness me, they've got a very big productivity advantage as well. All right. Last set of numbers there, and I'm going to put we're going to put our head on the block there and say where I think we are. So as I mentioned, there's been this tremendous increase in software TFP, at least measured in the US since 2019. That increase has been about 3 percentage points relative to before. The other way to cut this is to look at the intangible assets, R&D and all those various assets as well, marketing in particular. They've seen tremendous productivity gains as well relative to the average. So a number like 2, or a number like 2.5, we don't know whether it's going to be maintained or not, would not look like a terrible estimate of the current advantage in the upstream intangible sector. Where are we in the rows? Well, we've seen that software production is around 5%, but of course there's data production as well. We have in the UK a survey of software and data production, which gave you a number like around 10%. So we might be then in the middle row. So where would that take you then? We're going to tentatively suggest a gain of 0.65. That's percentage points per year in the steady state. So that's kind of relatively high relative to those numbers we saw before. Okay. I promise you, it's absolutely the last slide. Some facts. We tried to document some facts about US software, and that appears to be enormously productive and so forth at the moment. As I say, that would imply these AI gains in the steady state of 0.7. And lastly, to get back to it, why do we have these large productivity gains? It's because this is both a general purpose technology, so it's widespread, and it's an invention in the method of innovation. So it's a fast productivity growth in the upstream innovating sector, fairly widespread in that sector, and that gives you the high number. So you can think of this essentially as those shares. We started with steam, which had a very low share. With the steam, you had to invent the whole thing from scratch, a whole brand new steam industry and new transport equipment and all of that. Whereas AI, we already have the rails, as it were, upon which it is running, computers, systems and internet connections and all that kind of thing. That makes us then quite bullish about the possibilities of AI relative to previous technologies. Markus, I'll stop there. Thanks very much indeed to you and to everybody for listening.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Let me ask you something. If you were to compare it with other innovations, so of course we have the electricity and also, can you say a little bit, some health innovations too, which, we might argue makes labor also very much more productive. Can you draw some, innovations, let's say in electricity, some more contrast what you compared what you did already with the steam engine? To it?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And to be honest, Marcus, a lot of it is speculative. The electricity numbers, as I mentioned before, they're a bit higher than the steam numbers, but they're nowhere near as high as the ICT numbers. And again, we're just talking about it just took a long time for, in the language of the growth accounting, those shares to grow, but more generally just a long time for it to be diffused, for factories to be re-engineered and all of that. Now, that's sort of a little bit reminiscent of the J-curve effect that you were talking about in your introduction. Maybe it takes time for this to be introduced. Maybe it takes time for the reorganization of production and co-investment and all that kind of thing. I don't think we quite know the answer to that. But I think one quite interesting argument, as I mentioned before, is that, AI, there are already some rails upon which AI can run, right? So that the fact that 100 million people could sign up to ChatGPT within 2 months, which is an extraordinary number, is because all you needed was an internet connection and a computer. So if we've already got some of that infrastructure, then it could be that those J-curve effects are not as large as they previously might have been.
I see. So you're essentially arguing, some people argue, that diffusion is way more important than innovation, because the speed of innovation happens with certain, but diffusion typically slows things down. You would say in the world of AI, diffusion is actually much quicker as well. So,
well, from sort of casual, so look, this is going to be casual observation. So we ought, obviously, as scholars, we ought to be doing some proper science here. but just a casual observation of the use of ChatGPT, Copilot, and all of that. People are already using using this in kind of everyday office life and so forth. Slightly more. Let's be slightly more scientific for a moment, Marcus. I am struck by my colleagues at Imperial, where I work, and I'm sure other academics have a similar experience. I'm struck by my science colleagues. Imperial is an engineering and science college, essentially, by their use of AI and the extraordinary applications to which it is being put, and that has been adopted very, very fast and very effectively. So, as I say, we ought to be doing some more detailed studies on the adoption here. But certainly, if you go to and talk to at least the scientists who I talk to, they're very optimistic. They're already using AI and optimistic about its use.
And some people argue, AI is very much in the virtual world, but not in the physical world. Do you see, the adoption spilling over to the physical world, slowing things down? Or, robots will come and, AI will dominate robots as well. And do you see, you didn't talk much about the robots revolution in a sense.
No, I think that's a fair point. And I think it's fair that the robots are, they're often lumped in with AI. But I know, so a couple of things. I should have said, I'm mostly talking about generative AI. I should have been a bit clearer about that because, again, we've had AI for quite a long time, but the generative AI using these new types of technologies, which are just vastly more efficient around voice recognition, speech recognition, and all of that, is what we're talking about here. And having all of those implemented, I'm sure there are going to be bumps and lumps along the way to get them implemented, and there are going to be new procedures and so forth. But it feels like the adoption curve might be quicker than in previous eras.
So I know that you worked for many years at the Bank of England, and you mentioned what are the implications of your predictions relative to Daron's predictions for monetary policy or more generally inflation outlook and looking the next 5 years, let's say.
Well, should I stop sharing, by the way, Marcus?
Yes,
Sorry.
you can.
Okay, so let me just stop sharing a minute. Thanks for the question. Look, I hesitate to talk about monetary policy when you are the scholar who knows about monetary policy, but let me give you a view as a kind of hack economist, at least having a go at all of this. I was surprised when I got to the Bank of England and started talking about productivity, that in the Bank of England's model, an increase in productivity does almost nothing in the model, in the sense that the supply side gets better, but then within a couple of quarters, the demand side gets better as well. In other words, there's a sort of Say's law operating, which I sort of find amazing, actually, because if you read Sebastian Malemby's excellent book, The Biography of Greenspan, he talks about my terrific co-author, Corrado, working with Greenspan, discovering that the IT revolution really was a thing, and therefore that the US economy could be run hotter when you had this supply side increase. So I was surprised. That was the first reason I was surprised. The second reason I was surprised is, of course, Britain being the land of Keynes. Keynes hated Say's law. He thought Say's law was the ultimate villainy, which condemned the classical economists to being completely useless. So I found it sort of depressing and amazing that in the land of Keynes, Say's law was firmly, in the central bank's forecasting equipment. And the answer, of course, is that consumers in the Bank of England's model, at least, I'd be interested to know about other models, are rather forward-looking. Mm-hmm. And so when productivity goes up, their wealth is perceived to have gone up and their consumption goes up, and guess what? The demand, therefore, rises to meet that extra supply, a la Say's law. So what then crucially matters in the model is whether the consumers anticipate or not what's going on, which takes us, I think, to a tricky situation about, does the central bank know better? Do economists know better? Do consumers know better? All of that is to be sorted out.
But of course, the demand for leisure is going up too. Probably labor supply might shrink at the same time. In these models, I guess, in the Bank of England model. I don't know what they're going to model so well. What is effects as well in it, or?
There's bits of labour supply. There's not that much labour supply. We mostly take labour supply essentially from the population projections. What's mostly going on in the Bank of England's model, actually, as I say, are these sort of forward-looking demand effects. And most of the argument is about the extent to which they're forward-looking. So I mean, this is good. This is good, right? We need proper research to nail this down. Maybe consumers find certain types of supply side shifts more salient than other types, and all of that. So there's plenty to be done here.
But of course, as you indicated, there's huge disagreement how productivity will play out, whether it's like Daron Acemoglu says, minimalist, or it will be more sizable, very sizable. So given the uncertainty, you might also have some precautionary demand on that. And so the consumption might not go up so much given the uncertainty. Would you agree with that? Or is this also in the Bank of England model? I don't know. But
there's a bit of uncertainty in the Bank of England model. That's often put in rather ex post. I mean, the other aspect to this, Markus, is, as you know, there's a very big measurement community who are attempting to, upon which we economists rely enormously, who are attempting to get the price deflators right and get the measurement of GDP right. And indeed, there are some people. Diane Coyle has an important new book saying that GDP is just not going to help us when we enter this type of world. So I think it also throws up for grabs those wider measurement issues, as well as consumer attitudes and how to fit this into the various models. But again, that's good, right? We need we need more things to work on.
So a lot of things to work on, and thanks a lot for your presentation. It was fantastic, and we stay in touch. And I'm looking forward to the next version when we it realizes whether we have the high growth or lower growth subsequently. I hope that you're right. I think we need the higher growth rates in order to overcome certain challenges our society faces, and also climate and so forth, smart growth. And I think you gave us a good perspective of the various channels through which the high growth could materialize. Thanks a lot, John. And thanks a lot to all of you for listening to us, and hope to see you soon again for another event happening soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Markus. Thanks, everybody.